We are we are going to let folks make their way in from the waiting room, and we will get started in just a moment. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us on this snowy or rainy, depending on where you are, day. Either way, we are delighted to have you with us. Let me just this. All right. Uh, Delighted to have you with us for today's Lunch and Learn. Lydia Maria Child, a radical model for sustainable activism. And thanks to everyone who is watching this recording on YouTube. Lydia Maria Child was one of the 19th century's most radical reformers. She was born in 1802 and renounced early fame as a novelist in order to devote her life to democratic activism. She worked tirelessly and in the face of ostracism, violence, apathy, and war. Do any of those sound familiar to our current state of affairs? Working to end slavery and the racism that sustained it, and urging her fellow Americans to recognize self-sufficiency and respect for the natural world as crucial for democracy. I can't believe I've never heard of Lydia Maria Child before now, but I am so excited to learn about her today, and we could not ask for a better guide. We're joined today by Lydia Moland, who is an author and professor of philosophy at Colby College. Her new book, Lydia Maria Child, A Radical American Life, is going to walk us through Lydia Maria Child's life and the example that she can set for all of us about sustainable activism in our own social justice work. Welcome, Professor Moland. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting the environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this online weekly Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, our policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. A few notes before we dive in. You will hear from Professor Moland first, and we'll tackle all of your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I will synthesize them and put them in a nice order and ask as many of them as possible following the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, you can message Maggie Summers through the chat and she will help you out. We do ask that you not send your questions directly to Professor Moland. We want her to be able to concentrate on the presentation, not the chat box. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You can also find recordings of all of our previous programs on YouTube, where there are a number of playlists to help you focus in on particular topics. Whew, I think that's all of the business, which means we can dive right into the presentation. And Professor Moland, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and what a joy to be with all of you today. Let me just share my screen. All right, can I get a quick thumbs up if you can now see my PowerPoint? Very good, okay. So I was so grateful and honored to get an invitation to speak to you today, and thank you so much to Kathleen and Maggie for their help in organizing this wonderful event. Part of why I was so excited to get this invitation is that even though, as Kathleen already said, Lydia Maria Child's main work in her life had to do with racial justice and abolition. She was a passionate supporter of all kinds of progressive causes. And she was a real conservationist in her own right. And I'll talk about that in a moment. She had a very fierce dedication to the idea that democracy would not survive if people weren't able to think of themselves as conserving and as repurposing, and not only as consuming, which is something that I think bridges a lot of causes that some of us care about. Also, she had a very deep philosophical commitment to the idea that all truths are interconnected, so that fighting for racial justice is not distinct from fighting for environmental justice or other kinds of causes, that they were all rooted in a kind of philosophy of love, that she had lots of philosophical, sustainable background for. But since she spent most of her life fighting for racial justice, I just wanted to emphasize that for her, racial justice would never have excluded other kinds of justice. I also just want to focus for a second on the word that I've used in the title there, radical. So I've suggested that we think about her as a radical model for sustainable activism. And I just want to remind us that the etymology of radical comes from the word for roots. And I want us to think about Lydia Maria Child as an example of someone who was able to sustain a lifetime of activism, in part because she figured out where her roots were and what really fed her and sustained her and allowed her to grow and blossom. And I'm guessing that many people on this Zoom call today will recognize in that already one of the main questions behind any kind of activism, which is, to what extent do we play to our strengths and only engage in ways that are comfortable and familiar for us? And in what ways is it good and important for us to push beyond ourselves? I also, one of the highest compliments anyone has ever paid me about my book is that reading about Lydia Maria Child's life makes it impossible not to do something. She was an absolute doer, and she was really good at motivating other people to engage in very practical ways as well. So I just wanted to emphasize that as another way in which I think her message is an especially interesting one to talk about with you. So I will go fairly quickly through early parts of her life, and then I'm going to read just a little bit of my book to give you a sense of it, and then try to bridge us through towards the end of her life so as to think about how she sustained the kind of activism that she engaged in. So here she is as a young woman. She was born in 1802 in Medford, Massachusetts. Her father was a baker who had no interest in educating his daughters, but she had a younger brother who loved books and who passed his books along to her. And she very quickly went from being a prodigious reader to being a prodigious writer, so that by the time she was 22, she had done something almost unheard of for an American woman. She had published a novel. And the novel was very controversial. It had Native American themes, but it was successful enough that it really leveraged her out of her working class environment into Boston's literary elite, where she shone as a kind of luminary for several years, in part because she very quickly published another novel called The Rebels, about the American Revolution. And on the basis of that success, she was asked to edit something called the Juvenile Miscellany, which was one of the United States' first books for children. It was a kind of periodical for children, actually. It came out quarterly. And it had games and puzzles and stories and fiction and nonfiction. And it was a sensational success. It was the sort of thing that people far into their adulthood would remember waiting for on the steps of their houses for the mailman to deliver it to them. And so part of what I just want us to think about is that by the time she was 30, she had already really established herself as a successful and almost kind of a household name level author, praised in Boston in particular, but up and down the East Coast for sure. In 1828, she married someone named David Lee Child, who was an author and editor and politician himself. He was also more progressive than she was early at this point in her life. He was a very progressive on women's rights, more so than she was, and also on Native American rights. So their marriage was a kind of early partnership of activism. In 1829, she published a book called The American Frugal Housewife. I love the subtitle of this book, dedicated to those who are not ashamed of economy. And this was really her pitch to American housewives to fight for democracy, because she was already worried that a kind of consumerism and materialism was shifting the American public back towards the aristocracy that they had just fought a war to free themselves from. So the general message of this book is democracy will only survive if people know how to be self-sufficient, don't only go in for materialism, and know how to make their own soap. So it's this wonderfully practical book. It has advice on how to get rid of bed bugs, how to stuff a mattress. One of my favorite tips from it is that when a roast pig is half finished rather, when the eyes pop out. So just like take that into consideration when you're roasting your next pig. That's how you know it's half done. So this book was another book that people remembered far into their adulthood. They would remember which edition their mothers cooked from. It was said that no American housewife should go without it. So Child was kind of the Martha Stewart of her generation, but also always with this real political background. So here's one way in which I just sort of encapsulate what that book was meant to get across. Democracy is incompatible with unfettered consumption. This was something she really practiced as well as preached her whole life. And then in 1830, she met a man named William Lloyd Garrison, whom, as some of you will know, was one of the most important white abolitionists in Boston. Garrison had come to Boston to start a paper called The Liberator and to collaborate with the Foundation for Abolitionism that had been laid by the Black community. And his charge, as he saw it, was to win over white Northerners to abolition. It's really important for us to remember that abolition at this point was a radical, in the sense of way outside of the norm, cause. So many Northerners were very comfortable with slavery. Those that disapproved of it did so usually vaguely and without really thinking that it should end anytime soon, and certainly with no sense that that was because Africans and their descendants were our equals, but rather just that maybe it wasn't a good idea to enslave people. So William Lloyd Garrison was an abolitionist. This meant that he thought that slavery should end immediately and without compensation to enslavers. And this made him a social pariah. But he knew about Child's work. She was already that famous. He knew that she was good at practical advice and inspiration and had a novelist sensibility. He thought if he recruited her to abolitionism, maybe she could really help the cause. So he suggested that they meet. And here is the quotation that I always use to get across his effect on her. She wrote, "I was then all absorbed in poetry and painting, soaring aloft on psyche wings into the ethereal regions of mysticism. Garrison got hold of the strings of my conscience and pulled me into reforms. It is of no use to imagine what might have been if I had never met him. Old dreams vanished, old associates departed, and all things became new. I could not otherwise, so help me God." So it was a kind of conversion experience. And I'm guessing that some people on this Zoom call can remember moments in our lives when the scales sort of fell from our eyes and we suddenly were convicted about the rightness of a cause. So I want to read you just a little bit of what I wrote in after that quote. In other words, a conversion experience. A moment after which she could never live her life the same way again. A moment she had been prepared for, however unconsciously, by her curiosity, sympathy, and intellect, but a moment she neither could have predicted nor could now rescind. A conversion from apathy, or at least resignation, to urgency. Child doesn't record what Garrison said, but we can infer his message from the publications that had recently landed him in a Baltimore jail. Africans and their descendants were humans and our equals. They were being enslaved by the millions in the most brutal conditions imaginable. Their enslavement was made possible by Northern complicity. The duty to end it was immediate. The only question that remained was how. The walk from the modest rooms she and David now rented to her publisher's office still wound through the same uneven, crowded streets. Couples still promenaded through the Boston Common, arm in arm. Her publishing deadlines still loomed. But everything was framed by new questions. Some were large and theoretical. Was slavery a moral problem or a political problem? Whose problem was it, the North's or the South's? Then there was her career. Writing fiction while actual human tragedy gripped the South suddenly seemed frivolous. Publishing parenting manuals while masters raped their slaves and sold their own children felt grotesque. All things became new. In the midst of such anguish, remorse, exhilaration, resolve, and fear, it can be hard to know what to do next. To orient herself in her new moral landscape, Child turned to what she knew best: books. For the next 3 years, as she continued to live in a city that boasted all the trappings of power the young United States could muster, she immersed herself in the history, economics, and politics of her country's ongoing sin. Soon it became clear what Child had to offer the cause: her reputation. She had established herself as a reliable source of homey but aspirational advice. Her readers knew her to be frank but compassionate. But would they trust her through a transition from house cleaning tips to abolishing slavery? Would they follow her from treating dysentery to curing the disease at their country's core? I imagine Child, perhaps at her kitchen table, searching for her book's first sentence. Perhaps she thought again of the powerful men she passed every day on the street, men whose arguments she knew and whose power she no longer feared. Reader, I beseech you not to throw down this volume as soon as you have glanced at the title, she wrote, her handwriting graceful and even. Read it, if your prejudices will allow, for the very truth's sake. She thought of the women who cooked from her recipes and read her stories to their children. If I have the most trifling claims upon your goodwill for an hour's amusement to myself or benefit to your children, she wrote, read it for my sake. I imagine her looking around her frugal home, then turning back to her paper. Read it, she wrote, from sheer curiosity to see what a woman who had much better attend to her household concerns will say upon such a subject. So what did that woman say? As spring 1831 ripened into summer, Child began synthesizing her accumulated evidence into a methodical description of the arguments, excuses, and equivocations that had, all too recently, kept her from seeing the truth. She played to her strengths. With a novelist touch, she conjured images of slavery's brutality. With an educator's efficiency, she cited facts, figures, and studies, and sought out images she knew would get her readers' attention. As a pioneer of the American self-help tradition, she encouraged her readers to rely on their own thinking, just as they could rely on their own cooking. But she also left these sanctioned female spheres far behind, wading vigorously into economics, politics, legal theory, and history. With firm precision, she anticipated her readers' objections and refuted them one by one. It was as if she was determined to clear the underbrush of bad arguments and leave her readers open to the clearest moral pitch she could make. Africans and their descendants are human. Enslaving humans is evil. The time to end the evil is now. So the book that came from that conviction and from that research, I'm going to put under the heading Activist Engagement Part 1, which was just literature. So in 1833, Child published this book called An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans. You see the title page there, and also an illustration that she included of the kinds of torture devices that enslaved people were subjected to. This was considered absolutely indecent. You were not supposed to talk about that kind of thing in public, especially if you were a woman. And the book had chapters on the history of slavery, the economics of slavery, the politics of slavery, the morality of slavery. And then it ended with a chapter that laid the blame for slavery's continuation on Northerners. So the first sentence of her last chapter goes something like, "While we express our earnest disapprobation on our brethren in the South, let us not flatter ourselves that we are any better than they." And then she went on to document the racism that she saw every day on Boston streets. As you can imagine, this is not what your average Bostonian wanted to hear. And for having both transgressed all of these norms, especially as a woman, and for calling out her fellow Northerners on their complicity, Child was absolutely denounced and ostracized. She lost her reading public. She lost her income. She lost her place in Boston's elite that she had so recently won. I'll give you a couple of quick examples of reports of this. Mrs. Child was denounced. The politicians and statesmen scouted the woman who had presumed to criticize so freely the constitution of her government, of her country. Women, they said, had better let politics alone. Mrs. Child was a lady of whom society was exceedingly proud before she published her appeal, and to whom society has been extremely contemptuous ever since. Her works were brought with avidity before, but fell into sudden oblivion. So Child was undaunted by this. I will not say it didn't hurt her, it did, but she continued to use her literary talents and went on in the months and years after this to write several other shorter works, including the Anti-Slavery Catechism, Authentic Anecdotes of American Slavery, The Evils of Slavery and the Cure of Slavery, while also engaging in activism in other ways. She was very physically brave. She stood physically between anti-abolitionist mobs and abolitionist speakers more than once, counting on the assumption that even a mob would be less likely to attack a woman. She also helped lawyers who were friends of hers to put together legal arguments to help emancipate enslaved people who had been brought north by their enslavers. So she engaged over a whole range of things in the 1830s. But in the late 1830s, she and her husband decided to take a very different approach. Her husband decided to try farming sugar beets in an attempt to undermine the plantation cane sugar trade. So this was the idea that the economic power of slavery came from sugar to some extent, and that if something like sugar beets could undermine the economics behind the sugar trade, slavery itself would no longer be as viable. No one had ever grown sugar beets for sugar in North America. David Lee Child went to Europe to learn how to do it. He came back. The couple moved to Northampton, Massachusetts, where he then engaged in this, what I think of as agricultural activism. You can see he wrote a book about it. There are a couple of illustrations of his book on your screen there. He also won an award for his sugar beet experiments. But there were two problems. One was that he was unable to make this financially viable, so they went into debt more and more. The other thing was that Child herself was fairly miserable doing it. So she was in Northampton, which counted as a little bit of a backwater at that point. No offense to any of you who are from that part of Massachusetts. But she didn't have a library. She didn't have a desk. She didn't have access to her publishers or to her editors. And she didn't consider herself a farmer's wife. She very loyally helped him. There are wonderful letters from her about weeding beets at sunrise. But here's one quote from that part of her life: "A succession of trying circumstances led us here, and I ought to be thankful for the blessings with which I am surrounded, but I am in fact more homesick than I ever was in my whole life." As part of trying to get her husband out of debt, she then engaged in what I'm calling activist engagement part 3, which was editing. So she was asked to go to New York City to be the general editor of the National Anti-Slavery Standard, which was the journal of the American Anti-Slavery Society. She was the first woman ever to do anything like this, to publish a weekly political journal. And it consisted, as you can see on your screen, this is only half of a sheet of the National Anti-Slavery Standard. It was 4 pages long of 6 columns of tiny type that she had to fill once a week with things like congressional hearings about slavery, reports from different anti-slavery societies, accounts of abolitionist speakers being attacked by mobs. She also really wanted this journal to engage people where they were. She wanted to invite people into the abolitionist cause as opposed to shaming them for not being abolitionists. This unfortunately put her at odds with some of her allies who wanted her to be much more confrontational and use shame more as a way of calling people out. In our modern language, she was much more interested in calling people in. I'm sure this is an issue that many of you who've been engaged in activism know. And so one problem was that this put her at odds with some of her allies, and the other problem was that she hated it. So she was very successful at it. She like tripled its subscription list very quickly, but here's what she had to say about it. "I hate it with an inconceivable and growing hatred. This reading of papers and pamphlets and poring over congressional documents is perfectly intolerable unless sustained by the conviction that I'm doing some good to the anti-slavery cause." So because it was serving that cause and serving it really well, she kept doing it for a couple of years. But at the end of that time, she had a real breakdown. So I want to talk just very briefly about what was a decade of burnout, resolve, and despair for Child. So in 1843, this is a decade after her appeal was published, she resigned from the Anti-Slavery Standard. She broke with her Garrisonian friends who were abolitionists. This was an extremely painful part of her life. She lost many friendships. She also separated from her husband. They did reconcile, but for a long time they lived apart because they had such deep disagreements about how to address this cause that they both cared so deeply about. Resisting institutionalized oppression is hard on a marriage. She also would cycle between moments of despair and resolve. So here's a quote where she says, she's pledging to work in my own way according to the light that is in me and make literature the honest agent of my conscience and my heart. So that was in a moment where she's thought, okay, I can't do those things anymore. They're draining my energy too much, but I can make literature the agent of my conscience. But here's a moment of despair. She says, all my efforts seem to me so poor that in glancing back at them, I feel a profound contempt for them and for myself. This state of mind, of course, kills any power there might be to do better. And for that, I also reproach myself. It is a diseased state, but how to get well? And again, I'm guessing that many of us have had such moments. She was then, however, fortunate enough, if we want to call it that, to find a real moment of re-engagement. So in 1854, a good friend of hers who was also an abolitionist, Isaac Hopper, died, and it turned out he had asked her to write his biography. So this gave her a task, it gave her a focus, and she decided to tell his life in terms of the lives that he had helped save in many cases. So Hopper lived in Philadelphia, which was often the first city that enslaved people fleeing slavery would come to. He had spent his whole life helping them get on the next to the next step of freedom. And so she made this book about them, about the Black people that he had facilitated their quest for freedom. It sold very well. It integrated her back into the abolitionist community in a way that she felt more authentic in. And this really initiates a period of incredible activity on her part. At one point, she said something like, I feel like I was drowsy, but now I'm strong as an eagle. So I want to give you a couple of examples of how that played out. So after the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act, the city of Lawrence, Kansas was sacked by anti-abolitionist, pro-slavery ruffians, as they were called. Child wrote a short novel called The Kansas Emigrants to try to raise awareness of the Kansans who were fighting to keep Kansas a free state. In one of my very favorite episodes from her life, after John Brown instigated an insurrection in Virginia by going to Virginia, taking over a federal armory, the idea being to distribute the arms to enslaved people who could then stage an insurrection. When that failed and Brown was incarcerated, Child wrote to the governor of Virginia, Henry Wise, to ask permission to come and nurse Brown in jail. Wise wrote a very condescending letter back, accusing Child of being the instigator of John Brown's raid. He then published her letter without her permission, together with his own condescending letter in the press, as an attempt to shame her. She decided to take this as an opportunity to fight back. She wrote an 11-page letter back that prompted another woman named Mrs. Mason to write to her. She wrote a 25-page letter back. All of this was published as a pamphlet called Correspondence of Lydia Maria Child and Governor Wise and Mrs. Mason. This pamphlet sold 300,000 copies in the lead up to the Civil War. And I've seen some people speculate that there were soldiers who carried it with them to remind themselves what they were fighting for, since it so powerfully articulated her 25 years of honing abolitionist arguments. Here's one of my favorite quotes from that. If Captain Brown intended, as you say, this is to Governor Wise, to commit treason, robbery, and murder, I think I have shown that he could find ample authority for such proceedings in your public declarations. So a great example of her just like throwing back at him what he's accusing others of. As the war started, Child was busy helping Harriet Jacobs, who was a formerly enslaved woman, to write and publish her memoir, which has become one of the most important examples of what's called a slave narrative. That's a very interesting story, but another example of Child using her strengths as a writer and a publisher to help a Black person tell their story. At the end of the war, Child published something called the Freedman's Book, which was a kind of primer for newly emancipated Black Americans who were needing to learn how to read. She loved to turn her books into fundraisers. And in this case, all of the proceeds from that book were vowed to the freedmen, which meant to clothe them, house them, educate them as they tried to transition into full citizenship. I want to just end with a couple of short thoughts. I really appreciate the chance to share this letter with you, because I'm going to talk about a letter that was the first thing written by Lydia Maria Child that I ever saw. That was the thing that it was like touching a third rail for me, and I thought I need to know more about this woman. So this is 1874. The war is over. There are other causes that are rising to prominence, including women's suffrage. Child is also struggling to keep Americans' attention focused on Reconstruction, which is not going well. But at this point, women's suffrage is one of the major themes of progressive causes. So a woman named Abigail Williams May writes to Child and asks, would she endorse a petition refusing to pay taxes until women's suffrage is achieved? And Child reluctantly says no. So she says, I hate to say no to you, but here's her reasoning. Very likely the agitation it produces will help the cause of women's suffrage. During the progress of the anti-slavery struggle, many things were done and said which appeared to me wrong at the time and still appear to me to be so, though they unquestionably helped on the cause of anti-slavery by exciting a great deal of talk. I do not question the right of others to adopt measures that I do not feel free to make use of, but I have always resisted being drawn into an endorsement of proceedings that did not commend themselves to my own judgment, however popular they might be with my co-laborers. And I think that's such an interesting moment of just reflecting on her achieved wisdom at the end of her life, that the way she had been able to sustain after that period of disengagement was by only engaging in things that she felt were in her skill set and that she felt she could endorse with a full conscience. So here is an image of her at the very end of her life, and I'm going to end with one of my favorite quotations from her, which is something she said just a few months before she died. I think there is more work for me to do in the universe, and that I shall enter upon it with renovated powers. So it's an image of someone who knows that her physical and mental strength is ebbing, but still has a vision that she wants her work to continue or her spirit to continue in a way that will continue to work in the world. So as someone who tapped into her roots, which sustained her in ways that we, in this time of both chronic climate crisis and in an election year that also is a crisis, I think this is an example that we have much to learn from. So I'll stop there, and then again, with the encouragement of your wonderful organizers, I have a brief call to action. And I'm going to ask us just to spend a couple of minutes reflecting on the following things. So I invite you, if you have a piece of paper near you or something, just to jot this down, just to jot down a couple of thoughts here. So what are your skills and talents? Now that you've thought of a couple of those, let's just reflect for a moment on what kind of activism energizes and feeds you. And assuming that you have a few thoughts about that down, and of course you can continue on this after we're finished today, let's try to think of one concrete thing that each of us can do in the next week that pairs your skills with an activity that energizes you to act in a cause you care about. All right, and again, you can continue to reflect on those things as you'd like, but I do want to give us a chance to have a conversation, so I will stop sharing, and I'm very happy to hear what's on your minds.
Thank you so much. I love when you said that reading that letter from Lydia Maria Child was like touching a third rail. That is how I feel about this program right now. I am just my mind is the wheels are turning with all of these connections across time and lessons for all of us. And I know I'm not the only one because we've got tons of good questions in the chat, and folks can continue to send those along. As a reminder to everyone, you will get an email later this afternoon with the link to this recording. I have a feeling you're going to want to share it with plenty of people, as well as a link to find the book if you haven't read it. I cannot wait. This is my to-do for the weekend. And also that exercise that Professor Moland, you just led us through so beautifully, that sounds like just makings of a perfect dinner conversation this evening, or walk with a friend this weekend. So thank you for all of that. You'll get all of that material in your inbox, and we have some time to talk together. We'll So keep those questions coming, and we'll start with just a few sort of filling in a few gaps about Lydia Maria Child's life. So we have some guesses in the chat about what, if any, organized religion she may have been a part of. I'm not going to tell you all the guesses, but we're just going to ask: did she adhere to a specific religious belief? How big was that in shaping her activism, if at all?
Yeah, this was definitely a significant part of her journey. She was raised Congregationalist, which would have been a kind of Calvinist. As a girl, she lost that faith fairly early and really claimed to detest it as a sort of overly law-bound kind of faith that emphasized humans' depravity over their potential for goodness. The only church she ever joined after that was a Swedenborgian church. So Emanuel Swedenborg was a Swedish mystic, a reformer, well, not so much reformer, more philosopher and scientist, actually, who had a kind of Platonic view of reality and a vision of all humans being interconnected and all causes being connected through a real commitment to love. So she joined that church as a young woman. That also really counted as essentially becoming a heretic. I mean, people were not allowed to teach or preach if they were Swedenborgians. But she left that church also fairly early because of their lack of support for the anti-slavery cause. And she never joined another church again. She had lots of Quaker friends. She was very good friends with, like, Garrison was a very committed Christian. She herself deeply admired the teachings of Jesus, but really disliked organized religion. She did go to church in Wayland, which is where she lived the end of her life. One of the things I appreciate about that congregation, which still exists, is that while they talk very lovingly about her, they are also very clear that she never joined the church. So hers was a more spiritual, philosophical underpinning that fed her activist life.
Thank you. It's fascinating. And she just, wow. Okay. Next question. And then there's going to be a lot more. Did she have children?
She did not. She wanted children. They certainly tried to have children. We will never know why, and they probably never did either. But she did mourn the fact that she never had children, especially in her later years. One of the more touching anecdotes from her life on that topic is that she was also a beautiful drawer. She loved nature. She loved to draw flowers. And she kept a book of drawings and poetry about flowers that she wanted to give a daughter she wanted to name Rosa. And when it became clear that that daughter was not appearing, she gave that book to a niece. And that book survives, and it's at the Medford Historical Society. It's a beautiful, beautiful artifact.
Wow. Okay. Now I have a road trip to plan as well, because that sounds like it's worth seeing. And some of those, the struggle to find an organized religion that matched her outlook, the struggles to make peace with not having children when she wanted
Yes.
to. These are things we talk about now in a way that feels distinctly modern, but they turn out not to be unique to our times. I don't know
Absolutely.
that there's a question there, but
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Her life reads in such a contemporary way to me as well on those issues and on many others, including some of the ones that I mentioned just about. As I was writing this book, I was, which was after the 2016 election, I was watching progressive groups that I cared about schism and split and infight, all of the things that I watched her witness so painfully around those topics as well. There's real precedent for that, I'm afraid.
well, and one of the things that struck me is that concept of what we now call intersectionality, right?
Yes.
Sometimes feels new. And I can remember friends coming home from the Women's March in 2017 saying, I'd never heard this word before.
Mm.
What do you know about it? And here at MCV, we sometimes get questions about, what does democracy have to do with conservation? Or why is
Mm.
tribal self-determination an environmental priority? But Lydia Maria Child really seems to have gotten that in a way that, well, it sounds ahead of her time to me, but maybe it wasn't. Did other people get it at that time, or how did her sort of that idea of all truths being
Mm.
connected? How did that go over in the among her contemporaries?
Yeah, it's another wonderful question, in part because that was another real point of contention between her and some of her fellow Garrisonians who wanted the focus to be 100% on abolition. And she was always very convinced that even if slavery ended the next day, as long as white Americans had not reformed their hearts and had not shed their racial prejudice, that slavery would just reassert itself in another form. And I think one of the things that was most heartbreaking to her was during Reconstruction, when she could see that happening. And we see it now in the criminal justice system and in all kinds of the ways that racism is still so pervasive. And so when she, also in this attempt that she would make to try to invite people in, regardless of what drove them most as far as reform went, she wanted to make room for many causes under a general umbrella. I mean, another wonderful example is Native American causes. So her first novel, that one that was so controversial, was an attempt really to humanize a Native American warrior. It was prejudicial in all kinds of other ways, but it counted as very progressive for its time. And then at the end of her life, she returned to writing about Native American causes in ways that are very admirable, but also replicated a lot of the harms that white activists were doing and continue to do. I mean, one of the things that I learned the most about writing this book is about trying to avoid the sorts of mistakes that white activists have made. And in the book, I try to be really honest about moments where I think that happens with her as well. But so also in that kind of way, she feels very contemporary to me.
Absolutely. And I know we talk all the time about the ways that we know we're making mistakes even as we try to undo other mistakes, and that recognition that we're not going to do everything perfectly, and that doesn't make it okay, but it's not a reason not to try.
Yeah, and one of the phrases I sometimes use to describe her on that is a sort of fierce humility. So she knew she was part of the problem. And she would sometimes say things like, I'm sure I am getting things wrong and have gotten things wrong. And, if God judged us all as we should be judged, no one would escape. But she never paired that with a sense that she would stop or she would give up, but more with a determination to try to see ever more broadly and deeply into her own limitations.
So inspiring and so comforting in these moments that we make our own mistakes. I'm curious about that correspondence that got published between,
Yes.
that is just fascinating. Are there other pieces of her correspondence like that? Did she correspond with Harriet Beecher Stowe, or are there other people who we would say, oh wow, that is, I know that name?
Yeah, absolutely. She corresponded with everyone and anyone in the 19th century, including Abraham Lincoln. He never wrote back, but she sure wrote to him. um, and another one that I would mention is Frederick Douglass, and that's a really it's a episode that I talk quite a bit about in the book because it was in the context of that thing I mentioned, which was the Freedmen's Book, which was the primer for newly emancipated Black Americans to learn to read, to learn about their history. Unlike many other such books that were published, she was determined to include as many Black authors as she could, and also as much about Black history as she could. So she really saw the Freedmen's Book as a way of empowering Black Americans to realize that they had a history and a culture to be proud of as well. So she talks about Black historians, Black politicians, Black military leaders, African explorers, etc. She also makes really clear in the Freedmen's Book that Black Americans who were enslaved fought back, that they struggled for their own freedom. They weren't passive, they weren't victims. And in the process of doing that, she asked Frederick Douglass if she could replicate part of his story in the Freedmen's Book. And he wrote back and said, of course, use it however you think would be useful. Her letter to him does not survive, but his letter to her does. And so what's interesting about this exchange is that you have to sort of imply what she said in order to figure out why he says what he says. And part of what he says is, no, I have not met my former enslaver yet. I have not met with him. I have not reconciled with him. I have not forgiven him. I have no relationship with him. What that says to me is that she had written to him asking whether she could tell newly emancipated people that he had reconciled with his enslaver, because that was one of her goals. She wanted to make newly emancipated people forgive their enslavers as quickly as possible and reconcile with them. And I find that that's very problematic. I mean, it just puts incredible burden on these newly emancipated Black Americans who are struggling for their physical survival, now to be told that they were also expected to forgive. So I'm all in favor of forgiveness, but I think white people ask for it way too quickly without doing the kind of work that we need to do to earn it. And so in the book, I talk about that as an interesting moment where I think her hope for a better future got in the way of her being able to see how the burden of that hope was falling disproportionately on the people she was claiming to be helping. So there's one example. There are lots of examples. I'll stop with that.
No, it's so fascinating, and that is so problematic, and yet she apparently reached out and asked somebody with a much more important perspective to,
Yes.
did I get this right? And
yes, and that is good that she asked for his permission first of all and got it before using his story. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you think there's a Lydia Maria Child of our generation.
Well, Greta Thunberg, I mean, that's the first person who comes to mind. But I know there are many others, and I'm not as good at articulating them in particular. I tend to look for local leaders in cases like this, and I'm thinking about some of the people in the Wabanaki Confederacy here in Maine who are absolutely transforming the way I think about those issues in ways that I'm learning from, and also trying to rethink my own attitudes towards. So I would think of people in that community. I'm also thinking of someone who goes by Black Girl in Maine. who publishes and posts under that title, who just writes such wonderfully clear, uncompromising analyses of racial issues in Maine that I always learn from and find myself able to sort of check myself through. So those are just a couple that come to mind, but I think there are so many people who, you know, we most of us hadn't heard of Child. Most of us won't have heard of these people as well. It's important to look for those people in our communities and to raise their voices, to amplify their voices in a way that, you know, going back to Child's directive to us to be self-sufficient. And I'm not saying that this is what your question was suggesting, but, you know, we shouldn't be waiting for people to come and save us. We should be looking for people who are already doing things that we can help amplify, and then do whatever we can to make our voices part of that conversation as well.
I love that. The Lydia Maria Child of our time may very well be on this call, and it may be all of us. So that would be that'd be the ideal. How many copies of that correspondence did you say were published and carried into you mentioned how many Civil War soldiers may have had them
Yeah,
tucked
that I don't know, but the number of copies sold was 300,000. So that is the 19th century equivalent of going viral. I mean, it meant that there were copies in many, many households. And there were many people who said, if people would just read this and follow its arguments, we wouldn't have to have a war, right? This came out just as war started to seem inevitable, because it would, if people made space for it, it could change their hearts and minds. And one of the things that happened very quickly after that was that there was some indication that Virginia might abolish slavery because of the trauma of John Brown's insurrection had made the value of enslaving people fall. And so she, you know, spent every penny she had marching back and forth to the Wayland post office. She somehow got a hold of, you know, thousands of addresses in Virginia and mailed these pamphlets into Virginia in the hopes that it would have that effect. It didn't, but to me, it's another example of her kind of ingenuity. You know, how do I get these arguments into the hands of people whose lives might be changed? And as I said in my talk, I think it's something that all of us probably can think about, and I certainly do. When I know something is right, but I have all kinds of arguments and excuses percolating in my head that come to me really quickly, how do I clear those away so that my sense of what is right shines through? So I'll speak for myself. I know I can't keep living the kind of consumerist life that, you know, most of us are accustomed to living and still adhere to my belief that climate change is real. So what excuses am I using to keep from doing, and how do I clear those away? And what kind of arguments, and not just arguments, but encouragements can we give to each other that might not always be fun to deliver, but that can help people see, oh, actually, that is a terrible reason to avoid this moral truth, or that's not a good excuse. That's not a good, and just to clear those away, especially if we've had a moment of clarity like she had, and now want to pursue being able to being able to pursue that clarity as opposed to getting mired in these arguments.
Professor Moland, I don't want to let you go. We have more questions that our wonderful participants have asked. I have more questions. I want to go back to Colby College and take your class. I just thank you. This has been a really incredible hour, and we're cannot wait to talk to you again. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. If you, when you read the book, drop us a line, let us know what stuck out to you, what inspired you. We will be back in this space next week with a different kind of topic, but relevant to the work that we're all doing. We'll be joined by Dr. Sean Burkle, who is the state climatologist here in Maine. He's going to walk us through some crazy questions like what is going on with the weather and the climate and the wild storms that we have had recently. We hope to see you next week. And until then, have a wonderful weekend. Happy reading. Thank you again to all of you.
Thank you.